Hey everyone, it's OSK. Today I'm going to be talking about the Frostborn class and how to use it effectively in your games. We're going to be learning all the basics today, and I will even include a few advanced tips towards the end of the video. Now before we get into the Frostborn guide, do please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel if you enjoy Spellbreak guides just like this one. It really helps me out when you do that. Now without further ado, let's get into this. To start, let's go over the class overview and in-game description. Frostborn's in-game description reads, high damage from long range. It's a very accurate description but could definitely be expanded upon. Frostborn is a very unique class that does a lot of things in an okay fashion but doesn't really fulfill one singular purpose in a masterful way like some of the other classes do. Toxicologist is all about that close range damage, Stone Shaper is all about being a tanky bruiser, and Tempest is all about that high flying mobility. Frostborn is kind of a mix of these things. We'll get into all the skills later on in the video that will explain all of this, but for now, let's talk about the gauntlet itself. The Frost Gauntlet is easily the best offhand gauntlet in the game due to its reliable damage in the right hands at any range you're comfortable using it. The spell allows the player to charge up an Ice Lance that deals 72 max damage at full charge on a legendary rarity at any range you hit your opponents at. Some things to note are the automatic zoom during the charge animation, the large mana cost on an Ice Lance, and also the bullet drop as it flies through the air. Getting good with predicting the trajectory of your Ice Lance and the movement of other players is something that will only improve as you play the game, as there are no moving targets in the practice area of Spellbreak as of patch 1.2. The closest thing I can think of would be to charge a Conflagration-empowered fireball from the Pyromancer class towards a tall structure from a long distance away, charge up your Ice Lance, and try to hit a small fireball as it falls to the ground. It'll take some practice, but this should help. Other than that, just head into Clash. You might have a rough time at first, but you do what you gotta do. Frost's sorcery is Flash Freeze, and this creates a field of chilling air around the user after a brief casting period. It blocks lightning, fire, and wind spells on the outside part of the field, and will slow and freeze opponents who aren't running Harmony. Frozen players will stay frozen for 2 seconds, and will break away from the freeze if they take damage during the duration. It's a very niche sorcery that you don't want to use all the time, but as we'll find out later, it becomes much more useful once a certain skill is unlocked. Now let's get into elemental interactions. Frost and Toxic have some interesting applications. Spraying Toxic on a frost trail will create toxic puddles which can then be frozen over again to act as a regular frost trail. I'm going to jump the gun here, but the frozen toxic puddles can then be ignited to produce some lingering dragon fire which can really ruin someone's day. Frost will also freeze a toxic cloud which can then be jumped on and used as another platform, and a toxic spray will also completely eat through an Ice Lance, blocking the frost shot. Keep in mind though that the toxic cloud part of this can still be broken and ignited by stone and fire respectively. Some interesting interactions are freezing a toxic cloud while it's on top of a player will create a large area of ice mist which will slow and freeze opponents, and firing toxic through a flash freeze sorcery will freeze the toxic streams, preventing the creation of toxic puddles. Moving on to frost and fire, Ice Lances and flash freeze will completely block and clear all sources of fire. Shooting a fireball and creating a flame wall on a frost trail will create steam, which can then be frozen over as a frozen steam cloud, which is an obstacle that will block movement. One last interesting interaction unique to Frostborns or players with frozen alacrity is the ability to shoot through a flame wall if you're close enough. The way this works is the frost trail will eat through the flame wall, allowing your Ice Lance to travel through and hit your opponent. It can be pretty useful in a few situations. Frost and wind have a few interesting interactions as well. The biggest one has to be the slight shift in trajectory caused by shooting an Ice Lance through the radius of a tornado. Other than that, wind shears will blow away frost trails and ice mist, making the Frostborn have a rough time at it quite frequently. And lastly, the Flash Freeze sorcery will block wind shears as mentioned earlier. Frost and Stone have a similar story as far as frost trails are concerned, just ruining the Frostborn's day. Other than that, the only interaction present at this time is being able to freeze a boulder as it's flying through the air to create a frozen boulder with the ability to create a large area of ice mist similar to a frozen toxic cloud. This allows for a large amount of CC in Spellbreak when done well, so feel free to experiment. Lastly, Frost and Lightning just do not mix very well. Lightning can apply shock to frost trails and water puddles which will instantly stun a Frostborn skating over it, and lightning bolts are blocked by the Flash Freeze sorcery. One last interaction that I wasn't really able to test is that lightning bolts do break up Ice Lances when they hit each other traveling through the air. Again, I did not have a partner for this, so I can't show it in the video, but as of my memory, it does still occur, so be careful. Overall, an annoying time for both elements. Now that we're done with elemental interactions, let's get into the Frostborn class skills. The first skill is called Frozen Alacrity, and what it does is pretty obvious. Frozen Alacrity allows the Frostborn to create frost trails that can then be skated on by anyone for increased running speed. Pretty straightforward, shoot an Ice Lance and start running. Be careful though, as mentioned earlier, certain elemental interactions can ruin your fun. The second skill the class offers is Icicle, and this lets you hover in the air while charging your Ice Lance and also highlights visible enemies in your vicinity with a red outline. This can be very useful for scanning for enemies who are difficult to see and keeping your team informed about the enemy position all around you. Keep in mind though that it does leave you as a sitting duck while floating in the air, so do be careful. Frostborn's third skill is Tundra, and this adds that little bit of extra oomph to the flash freeze sorcery I was talking about at the beginning of the video. Tundra not only doubles the duration of your flash freeze, but also makes you immune to damage while casting the sorcery itself. This can allow for some insane outplays and can even save you and your team's life if you time it properly. This skill in particular is a force to be reckoned with, so use it in a pinch if you need to. The last skill of Frostborn is Ice Prism, and this is where the damage can really rack up. Ice Prism allows you to overcharge your Frost Lance for half a second to increase the damage by 35%. This stacks additively with Focus Mana and Recklessness as well, which can really allow you to dish out massive damage and is the basis for one of the builds I'll show later on in the video. Basically, this skill just increases your potential damage output. Not really much else to it. I'll get into a bit of the nuances with it a bit later on, so stay tuned for that. Now let's get into some of the builds you want to run on the Frostborn class as of patch 1.2. The first build I have for you guys is going to be a support variant that's very useful in squads. For talents, you'll want to run Harmony, Finders Keepers, and Recovery with a Fire Offhand and a Dash Rune. This is your standard backliner build and does a good job of providing you good sustain with Recovery and safety with a CC immunity with Harmony. Finders Keepers is there as a filler talent, and it can be used for funneling strats for a Toxicologist or Stone Shaper on your team. The Fire Offhand is here to cover a wide range of options and has decent damage for an offhand. And of course, Dash has a nice cooldown, so here you go. The second build I'll talk about is the beloved Glass Cannon build, and this is one of my favorites. You'll want to take Focus Mana, Scavenging, and Recklessness for your talents with a Stone Offhand and a Teleport Rune. This build is all about the damage and needs no further explanation. It's a very fun build to run in Clash especially. In this build, we have taken all the damage mods we can with Focus Mana and Recklessness, and Scavenging is there as your only source of sustain once you snipe your opponents to oblivion. What you want to do with this class is avoid all the close range encounters you can and try to land Ice Prism empowered snipes as much as possible. It should also be advised to try and avoid levitating as much as possible so you get the most out of Focus Mana, which should be an extra 30% damage on every snipe. As an offhand, we have Stone just to go bonk and land as much damage as possible up close, and Teleport is a unique option here. The main goal is to be able to reposition in a quick fashion so as to avoid any collapsing on your position. This should allow you to create space in a safe fashion so you can line up a huge snipe and recover with Scavenging. That being said, it's definitely not the most viable going into Battle Royale, so be careful guys. It is a glass cannon for a reason. Lastly, I'll talk about the Duelist variant of Frostborn, and no, I'm not talking about playing your last pathetic card. From what I remember, I don't think I've seen anyone run this variant of Frostborn. This is pretty solid for those 1v1 engagements in Battle Royale and should help you get some solid wins with enough practice. For this, you want to pick Runic Fluency, Fortitude, and Recovery for your talents with a Toxic Offhand and a Shadow Step rune. What this build allows you to do is outplay your opponents in a 1v1 setting. I would typically recommend taking this build into solos, although it can work in squads as well. If you want to take something like this into Clash, I would recommend switching Fortitude for Scavenging just because Scavenging is so good as an extra source of health and sustain in Clash. The main goal of this particular build is to give you as many tools as possible to take out your opponent in a 1v1 engagement. Runic Fluency is going to give you that extra rune charge, which when paired with Shadow Step can really help you disguise your attacks and escape if you need to. Fortitude is a nice little overshield that will help give you an advantage in a long-range Frost Mirror matchup, and it'll also block a Fireball or an Outbreak Slap, so that's always nice in a pinch. Recovery is Recovery, so you know that's always going to be good unless it becomes really bad in patch 1.3, so put a rain check on that just in case. Of course, pick up a Shadow Step for the outplay potential, and Toxic is there for some big close range slaps. And the reason Toxic is picked over Fire in this case is the possibility of you freezing an opponent in a Flash Freeze and then needing to slap some really quick damage, as Flash Freeze does not block Toxic streams when they pass through its radius. So go out and try these builds and see how they work out for you. Now on to some advanced techniques for the Frostborn class. The first bit of tech we'll talk about is what's known as Icicle Sliding. This technique is very simple to do and can work wonders out in the world when in a duel. Basically, Icicle conserves the horizontal momentum you get when you begin the hover animation, allowing you to move while floating in the sky. By coupling this with different runes such as Dash or Shadow Step, you can cover quite the distance while charging up an Ice Lance against your opponent. Doing this correctly will help make you a more difficult target to hit for your opponents and should net you some decent mobility at the same time. The next technique I have for you guys is another simple one, but the application of it is quite advanced. Tundra tanking is the act of transitioning into the front line of a fight or just charging into an attacking opponent and using the Flash Freeze sorcery with the added benefits Tundra provides you. This will make you immune to incoming damage while also applying the long-lasting AoE of Flash Freeze. Using this correctly usually nets a slow or two and potentially a freeze and provides decent cover for the rest of your team in the process. By doing this effectively, you can provide your team a great distraction to then allow them to take advantage and follow up with some heavy damage. The use of this, again, is very advanced and is often done based on the feel of a fight and how the flow of combat is shifting, so it may take some time to get this particular strategy down. The last piece of advanced tech I have for you guys is going to be a bit of a cheese strategy, but it works as a great engage in squads and sometimes clash if you can get the drop on people. This is what's known as drop freezing. By canceling your sorcery 3 times in the sky, you will no longer be able to float by holding your sorcery. You can use this fact to your advantage to then dive onto people from above and instantly catch them in a flash freeze sorcery. Unless they're running Harmony, this should immediately slow and maybe even freeze them. If you've empowered a Tundra to make yourself immune to damage on the way down, that's even better. If you get the freeze off, you can then charge up an Ice Lance to get some free damage or even use your offhand gauntlet depending on the situation. Feel free to test these out for yourself and use them in your games. I'm sure at least one of them will work out well for you. Before we go, here's some general tips you're going to want to follow as a Frostborn in Spellbreak. Generally, as you drop into the Hollow Lands, you do not want to be taking early fights. A common Frost without an amulet will drain your entire mana pool regardless of how long you charge it, so look for loot early on, especially a better rarity of Frost and a belt, and then go for the kill. It is very apparent that Frostborn is the worst early game class in Spellbreak. Another thing you want to try to do is stay out of the immediate action and keep your distance during fights. Frostborn is essentially the sniper class of Spellbreak, and you'll want to treat it as such. In line with this piece of advice, not only do you want to play as the backline for your team, but keeping high ground is going to be essential for your Frostborn games. This opens up so many angles of attack and allows you to really utilize your Icicle's skills' target tracking ability. This should allow you to see approaching squads, enemies trying to hide, and also areas you could potentially rotate to once the zone starts closing. As you are starting to rotate, likely on Frozen Alacrity, be sure to keep a lookout for Stone and Wind users as they can really ruin your day, as you might have seen from the Elemental Interactions section. Both of these elements can break apart your trails, which will then spawn Ice Mist, which will slow and freeze you if you're not careful. Either make sure you're being very careful and coordinating with your team, or just run Harmony. Harmony has picked up quite a lot on Frostborn entirely for this reason as of patch 1.2. It'd be nice if this changes in the future, but for now, this is the case. And lastly, as you're trying to land that one big snipe, don't be afraid to fire off shots prematurely. Oftentimes, getting a little bit of damage multiple times can be more effective than trying to land one big source of damage and risking a miss or getting damaged in the process. I oftentimes will fire off frost snipes at about half charge for 50 damage if I know it will hit, as opposed to waiting for a potential 70 or so damage that might miss. It's ultimately a feel thing, so experiment and see what works well for you. And that is going to be the end of my Spellbreak Frostborn guide. I hope you all enjoyed the video and learned something today. Of course, if you have any tips of your own that I did not cover, be sure to leave it in the comments section down below. I really hope you guys enjoy these video guides I love making, and if you did enjoy, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for even more guides just like this one. Also be sure to follow the socials down in the box below. That's going to do it for me. Y'all have a great day, and I will see you all out there.